My name is Francis Wong. I'm a musician. I play the saxophone. I'm also a composer, and I'm also a community worker. I do a lot of work in various Asian American communities of San Francisco, using art and culture as a way to build community and to also advocate for our rights and to make a better society. I also am a scholar, and I teach in Asian American Studies here at San Francisco State University. Actually, well, I grew up studying music, but I didn't gain a sense of purpose until I was involved in the Asian American movement of the 1970s. And we began to have different kinds of activities when I was organizing, and we realized that you couldn't always be having a meeting or a protest, that you had to have potlucks and concerts and dances, and had to have things that gave a sense of how joyful life can be. And also, we couldn't be listening to speeches all the time, so playing music with poetry, like with a Janice Mirkatani poem or something like that, were ways in which to connect our messages and our motivation in more lively and, I guess I would say, less heady kind of ways. One of the things I follow is this idea of celebrating our cultural heroes or people in our history. And I did learn a lot about that from particularly in the black music tradition, in the black arts movement. And so there was some, just like they celebrate Crispus Attucks. And so I kind of took that kind of idea, and I said, well, why don't we apply it to Chinese Americans? And because I knew about this story of Joseph Pierce. And in this particular song, I wrote it in 3 because it's this kind of conjures up that time, that period of time of the Civil War. So one version of playing this song would be if there be a snare drum and this kind of looping kind of feeling that is from that period of time. But at the same time, the middle section of the piece kind of is drawn from certain ideas that we use in Chinese music. So that's kind of how I came up with it. So I think with the civil rights songs, I think it has to do with the intent of those who were singing it and the context in which it's being rendered. So I don't think that civil rights songs were really meant to be owned by, let's say, particularly African Americans. I think as long as one acknowledges their roots in African American culture, and at least that's kind of, because I engage in African American rooted art forms, improvisation, creative music, and I work with African American musicians. And so the point is that we recognize the cultural legacy, that these musics are a gift. And so it's really then, if it's rendered in the form of passing along a message, a feeling, I think it's great. I remember one of my relatives, because as a Chinese American, being a musician is not a traditional or orthodox profession. And so sometimes when people talk to you, it's well-meaning, but they'll say something, well, you must really love it. And then I guess my response is that it's really not about something I like to do or love to do, but it's something that I must do and that I'm compelled to do. Okay. Well, I don't. I think I was just. I play music because it's human. It's not really about me, you know. I just. It spoke. Music spoke to me, and when I started playing music, I figured I could do it. So I think that's why I do it. Well, I always think about my musical education starting with my parents' love of music, because they went through the war in China, and they had a hard time. They were refugees coming to the United States, and for them, music was kind of helped them get through these difficult times. And so they always appreciated what music could do. And so that's part of their motivation for wanting me to play music. And then I took violin lessons, but I also played music in school, which actually I think was the very important part of my music education, because it was part of education. And so we had playing orchestra and playing band. Actually, that's how I got to play saxophone, was because I played the violin, and then there was cuts to the budget, and they cut the orchestra. But my music teacher really wanted me to stay in music, so he says, well, why don't you, here's another instrument. And these instruments were paid for by the school, so I actually had access to other instruments when I needed to change and to be part of the band. So I really owe the school, public schools, for my continuation in music. So in some ways it's not disconnected to my later activism. I would say that at the university level, historically, it's been challenging because music and art that comes from our backgrounds is not considered part of what is called music. So in a lot of ways, a lot of what we call music is called, we're lucky to have it in ethnic studies, but it's not really covered in mainstream music departments because of the dominance of the European canon. So we haven't even gotten to the place about getting cut. I think that I was inspired by, during that time of, I guess it was the late 60s and early 70s. So to me, saxophone players like John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, or before them Charlie Parker, these African American masters, really cultural heroes, American cultural heroes that represented the future and best vision for our society. And so I felt I was drawn to that, and it wasn't really a heady thing. It's like their music kind of, like John Coltrane's music just went through me and I resonated with it. So then I just felt like I had to kind of follow that. And so that's how I chose the saxophone. So, one of the things is I write music, and so one of the things that you get to do when you write your own music is you get to name it, and you get to say what you think it's about. And so, in a lot of ways, Asian Americans are not represented very well in the body of music that's written. And so, in a lot of ways, our stories don't exist. And so I believe in that idea of writing ourselves into existence. And it's about this guy named Joseph Pierce, who's a Chinese American veteran of the Civil War. And he fought on the Union side. He was a former slave. He was sold into slavery in China, and he came to the United States. And because his owners were in Connecticut, he was freed. And he took the name Joseph Pierce because they called him Joe, and Franklin Pierce was the president, so he took the name Joseph Pierce. When the Civil War started, he joined the Union Army, and his first battle was Antietam, which is probably still considered, I think, the bloodiest battle in terms of the largest number of Americans who died in a battle. And so then he fought at Gettysburg, and he survived the war, and he lived until 1916. So he lived the whole 50 years after the Civil War. In a lot of ways, he was part of one of the founding people of ancestors of Chinese Americans, and so I wrote this song for him, so I could tell that story. I guess since I started college way back in the day, I always noticed that the whitest departments, the most European dominated departments, were the arts and literature departments. And because I think that's one of the main things that's denied us as part of a effort to think that European culture is better and superior to our own culture and our own ability to make our own music and art. And so I think that in a place like City College, which is overwhelmingly people of color, that the idea of people of color playing music is in some ways a little bit frightening to the establishment. And so, and sometimes in communities of color, because we don't have the privileges, so sometimes people think that we won't miss it if it's cut. So I think that oftentimes then one way to kind of cut the soul out of a movement or cut the soul out of a population is to deny them their art. And so I think that that's underneath this idea. What we do in art is actually we make history. See, the thing is that in some ways history doesn't exist because it's part of the imagination. Because we can't go back in time, or maybe some people can. I don't know. I mean, there was that movie with Denzel Washington, but even that's a piece of art. So that's a piece of imagination. So we have to imagine history. We have to imagine what happened, how people felt, how people thought. And so when we talk about the history of the Asian American movement, we do go back to old video and old songs that people who started the Asian American movement did, like Nobuko Miyamoto and Chris Ujima. They wrote a song, "We Are the Children of the Migrant Workers." And so there's an important piece of how we can effectively imagine history if we have access to art from that period of time. And in some ways, that's what art is. Art is a form of time capsule. We put what's happening to us in the moment, and we can actually put it into a capsule that can be given to future generations. And so if we're not given that opportunity, that means we will have people in the future who will feel like they have no history because there will be no songs to look back on. I like that there's this expression, music is the healing force of the universe. So I just like to think that music is healing and that we use it to, that we engage in it as it's a spiritual practice. So, and it's a way to recognize and recognize our connection as different souls.